would live along the frontiers with the armies, and they only rarely visited the capital. This completed a long process. So some of you may know Tacitus's famous saying about the civil wars in 68, the so-called Arcanum Imperii, or the secret of empire. So the civil wars in 68 revealed the secret of empire was that an emperor could be made other than at Rome. Well, in the 3rd century, another historian, a Roman historian writing in Greek, he added the sequel to this claim, and he said, Rome is now wherever the emperor is. And that included Trier, Milan, Sirmium, Thessaloniki, Nicomedia, Antioch, and finally Constantinople. All of those cities, which were closer to the frontiers, were briefly called New Romes in various ways before the label stuck onto Constantinople and stayed there. So this was part of the process by which the Roman Empire was turned inside out. Right? What's important is no longer the city of Rome, but where Roman history is taking place, especially along the frontier, and where the emperors and the armies are making history at all these provincial capitals. The old core was sort of stripped of its importance, which went to the periphery, like to Constantinople, which is in Thrace. Complete backwater from the perspective of anyone in Augustus's Rome. So I'll now come to the Capstone criterion for a credible Roman claim. Actually, it's less of a capstone and more of a foundation. And this is having a Roman res publica, or a res Romana. Now, what does this mean? Well, I can't do better than quote Cicero. So a res publica, he says, quote, is the property of a people. But a people is not just any collection of human beings brought together in any sort of way, but an assemblage of people in large numbers associated in an agreement with respect to justice and a partnership for the common good, end quote. In other words, they need to be a people unified in accepting a normative political order which they can all navigate based on possessing a common culture and an agreement that they constitute a single people under a single political order. Thus, the Romans have their res publica, other people might have their own. Having a res publica, by the way, does not entail having a specific type of regime. For example, not having kings. That is a distinctive criterion of modern republicanism, not ancient or medieval. In the Roman tradition, and in Cicero specifically, it is the coming together in a single polity defined by a common set of laws and a culture that counts. It is a polity in which the government and any legitimate apparatus of power serves the common interest of the populus Romanus. This is, by the way, a very distinctively Roman way of theorizing the polity. It doesn't have much of a counterpart in Greek political thought. Now, the people we call Byzantines thought that they were Romans in precisely such a way. What we call the Res Publica Romana, they called the politia of the Romans. Now, politia is the term that we get polity from. Politia is also the title of the book that we call Plato's Republic. The original Greek is politia. But what the Byzantines called the politia and what Plato called the politia are two completely different things. Plato meant the type of regime that governs a city. In the Byzantine tradition, a politia means this Roman sense of res publica. And this is one example of a classical classical Greek term with a very impressive history in Greek thought that has actually been hollowed out and colonized by a Roman concept. So the way I put it is that, yes, politia is a thoroughly Greek word in Byzantium, except for what it means. And in fact, we can trace the process during the Roman Empire by which the term res publica, which is very, very common in imperial usage, is translated as politia until it becomes the accepted and only translation. Well, that's not the only translation. A whole bunch of these other terms are used somewhat interchangeably. Okay, so these Romans of the East then have a common language, law, religion, a state, system of taxation, culture, and army. These are very unified in Byzantium. The Byzantines themselves definitely qualify as a Roman Respublica in Cicero's definition. Moreover, it is clear that they understood their monarch, the emperor, as specifically the emperor of the Roman people. This wasn't just an emperor in the abstract, just kind of on his own. That office only made sense in relation to a specific political community. It wasn't self-subsisting or anything. I'll give you an example. In the early 10th century, there was a Bulgarian king, emperor, call him whatever, Simeon, and he started calling himself, he was very aggressive toward Byzantium, and he started calling himself the emperor of the Bulgarians and the Romans. Now the Byzantines had no problem with him calling himself an emperor, but they drew a line at the Roman part. And an ambassador was sent to him, and he asked him, "Of which Romans exactly do you claim to be the emperor? If you rounded up some Arab prisoners, would that make you the caliph?" So we should send that to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. You do it. But he says in his inaugural speech that he's entirely open to criticism and advice. Okay, so likewise, when Charlemagne proclaimed himself emperor of the Romans, the Byzantines had no problem calling him emperor. It was just of the Romans part that bothered them because they were the Romans. And he was not their emperor. Okay, so confirmation of this picture can actually be found in the Byzantine sources. But it's also in Louis's letter to Basil that I quoted earlier. He actually accuses the Eastern Emperor of not having been appointed by the Pope, but rather, and I quote again, solely by being designated by the Senate and the people, which is true. And he thought this made Basil look less Roman. Now, if we look at the Western claims to Romanness, of which Romans did the German emperors claim to be the emperors when they call themselves emperors of the Romans? Well, I've looked. I'm not an expert on medieval Germany and stuff, but I've looked and looked and looked. And as far as I can tell, they were never quite sure. The only self-professed Romans that they sometimes had in their empire were those of the city of Rome. And as we saw, the Western emperors were generally reluctant to insist on that criterion too much. Now, there was otherwise great uncertainty about what this meant. It was certainly a cool title to have, right? I mean, I can totally understand why, if you're Charlemagne, you're the leading guy in this whole continent, and the Roman Empire is the closest thing in your memory and your imagination to what you're aspiring to. But in the Roman tradition, this had a very specific meaning, and I don't think it really applied that much in the medieval context. For that reason, Western medieval authors developed a whole range of theories as to what was Roman about the title. Now the leading one, or a leading one, was that the Western emperor was an emperor by virtue of the fact that he ruled over many subordinate kingdoms, realms, and peoples. It's kind of like an uber lord of smaller states. Now this did not exactly make him or his subjects Roman, but the Roman Empire was probably the likeliest historical precedent that they had for that kind of situation. But there were other explanations. For example, that he was the emperor of the Romans because he was crowned by the Pope in Rome, or because he had the duty to expand Christianity, or because they had won spectacular battles that deserved triumphs in the ancient Roman manner, or because sometimes their realm included the city of Rome, or because they would perform the apocalyptic role of the last emperor when they wrote these prophetic fantasies about the end of times, and so forth. And they argued about these criteria all the time, often because they were in conflict with each other. Right. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not presenting this as a contradictory mess, which it sort of was, to refute Western claims to the Roman legacy. So the Germans had as much a right as anyone to cultivate and develop the Roman tradition that had come to them in the shape that it had. And I'll give you one example. I'm pretty convinced that the Western medieval world sort of emerged as a kind of unit, of a civilizational unit, in part because it was able to access these Roman paradigms and archetypes that allowed them to talk to each other having a common framework. I'll give you one example. I mentioned the Trojans. So it became very conventional in the medieval West to claim a Trojan ancestry for your people. And this was basically a way of inventing mythological traditions going back to this common source that enabled lots of people in the West and the North to come into some kind of relation with each other where they sort of understood who they were. By the 13th century, this had expanded, this had become such a popular trope, right? I mean, so even the Norse, the Scandinavians, right, were claiming Trojan ancestry. That there's even some pushback about this. So some medieval theorists are saying enough, not everybody can be descended from the handful of Trojans who fled from Troy. But I think that that's sort of missing the point. The point was they were creating a common framework within which they could, find some way of talking to each other. And this worked for ancestry and its ethnicity, but also for language and for politics. The Roman imperial title and references to Rome allowed the West to sort of coordinate their different traditions. Okay. But the point is, at least in this specific criterion, this doesn't add up to much of a res publica, especially as the Western Empire was so incredibly diverse in terms of ethnicity, language, local law, administration, and territorial substates. So regions were often de facto independent, they had different histories, conventions, cultures, and so on. And all this excluded having a single res publica. And there was also the shadow cast by the Eastern Empire, which around, let's say, the year 1000, was far more powerful and prestigious than anything in the West. Under Otto III, for instance, there was an author, an imperial author, and he wrote that, so he's pushing back against Eastern claims. And he's saying, the Roman Empire is ours. It's ours, he emphasizes. It's better than that of the Greeks in might and eloquence. And he wrote another work to prove that Greece, as he called it, should not have a monopoly of imperial philosophy and Roman might. This is such a far cry from later denying that they have any right to it at all. Okay, in sum, conclude. In the West, we have a Latin-speaking, neo-Roman imperium with no Romans, if we exclude the people of Rome. Whereas in the East, we have a Greek-speaking, neo-Roman imperium full of Romans, but kind of Greek speakers. So it is no wonder that these two, sometimes rivals, sometimes partners, could not actually make their claims interface enough to achieve some kind of resolution and understanding. They were simply asymmetrical, as each developed different aspects of the Roman tradition and ignored others. And there was also a history full of conflicts and crusades that got in the way of understanding. So in conclusion, I'll mention 2 points. One, it was in the 3rd century that Rome kind of became an idea, right? So think of it as, it's not something that was physically instantiated in the city of Rome or in a particular people. It's kind of, this is when it became digitized and infinitely reproducible. Once it left the city of Rome, it was extended as an idea throughout the Roman Empire, from Britain to Syria, and it became a cultural resource that people in all of those areas could use and transform in different ways. In the case of Byzantium in particular, I will note the following paradox. When we're thinking about Western civilizations or Western cultures, and it's very difficult, of course, to try to define them, but one way of tracking cultures today that might have a claim to being in that group is, let's say, if something about their intellectual genealogy leads back to ancient Greek thought and literature, if something about their political and legal traditions leads back to the Roman Empire or Rome in some way, and if their religious traditions lead back to Christianity in some way, right? Byzantium then emerges as the Western culture par excellence. It's the only one in all of history that combined those 3 elements in more or less their original form. It's the only place where you can study a culture that had direct access in Greek to the ancient Greek tradition and used that language throughout, that was a Roman state, made up of Romans in their collective respublica, and that actually professed a form of Christianity, orthodoxy, which was the closest to the original materials, the New Testament, and the church councils and patristic tradition, than anyone else. And so this is kind of a paradox here that if you use that criterion, Byzantium should be the sort of core definition of Westernness. I'm not actually making that argument. I'm just pointing it out as a strange paradox. And I'll close with that. Thank you very much.